Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Star back with you here, guys. We are going to be taking a look at Chapter 9, Key Issue 3 and 4, but we're going to kind of break them up for you. This is a lot of information here in Key Issue 3 and 4. So we're going to start off with Chapter 9, Key Issue 3, and the big question we have is, where is agriculture distributed? Now, that is a huge question because there are all different types of agriculture that are distributed all across the world. We're going to take a look today at subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture. So buckle up and let's take a look at agriculture. When we start off, guys, we're looking at the agriculture of the world, and we look at this as the Whittlesey map that we talk about from time to time, and this is looking at all the different biomes and all the different areas around the world where different types of agriculture thrive. And so if you take a closer look, you can see that specifically like through the Middle East and Northern Africa, we see a lot of pastoral nomadism. Around the Mediterranean region, we see Mediterranean agriculture and so on and so forth. And so as we look at this, we're going to have an idea of, should have an idea of where all these different types of agriculture actually exist and where they're practiced around the world. And so this map of world agricultural regions is actually fairly important. And so you should recognize that as the Whittlesey map as well. So here's kind of our connection to climate when we start looking at some of these different places. Pastoral nomadism, obviously, we just mentioned throughout Northern Africa and the Middle East, and into Central Asia as well. Obviously, that's an area that it's not going to be real easy for you to grow crops. And so that's one of the reasons why pastoral nomadism thrives there. We'll talk more about that. We get to, you can see in kind of some of the rainforest regions, the shifting cultivation, which we'll take a look at. And then we get into some of the others like Mediterranean and ranching and commercial gardening and things like that. So we'll talk about all these different types of agriculture, what they mean, what they are, as we go through today. The first ones we're going to talk about are agricultural types that are called subsistence agriculture. And we're going to start off with a specific type of subsistence agriculture called intensive subsistence agriculture. Now, subsistence agriculture in general is most commonly found in lesser developed countries around the world. This specific type, intensive subsistence agriculture, is usually found in kind of densely populated, lesser developed countries. The farm fields are usually pretty small. They try not to waste really any land whatsoever. A lot of times animals are the farm equipment or tools that they're using. You can see that in the picture in the top there. The dominant crop when we look at this is actually wet rice. That we see that most commonly in Southeast Asia and East India. And so if you take a look at the other picture on the right, they plant these little seedlings in the field. They flood the fields, or they're called sawas or paddies, and they are extremely extensively labor intensive. All right. A lot of work for farming for rice, but you get a lot of nutritional value out of the rice then, and a lot of caloric intake can happen with the rice that you have. So that's actually a fairly important crop overall worldwide. We also have another type here when we look at in northern China and the interior of India. We tend to see a different type of intensive subsistence agriculture, and that's more like a dry version of it. It's usually wheat, barley, or other grains. And a lot of times they'll use crop rotation in order to continue to farm more out of each plot of land. And sometimes you'll see some cash crops growing there too, cotton and tobacco. So that's kind of the picture you see, or the image on the top there is more of the wheat, barley, or other grains being used. And then the one on the bottom is that intensive subsistence wet rice agriculture. So there you can see the rice production in the world. That shouldn't be any surprise after we just talked about where we typically see the wet rice subsistence agriculture. Here's some other examples of different intensive subsistence agriculture around the world. Again, the ones with the water you can see obviously being the rice paddies or sawas. You can also see a little bit of the how many people it actually takes to farm this land extensively here. Another type of subsistence agriculture is shifting cultivation agriculture. This is really common in tropical areas. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as slash and burn agriculture. And so this is a type of agriculture that is is a little bit difficult for maintaining the land. We look at it as kind of a cycle. You have to continually clear new land in order to continually farm the land around it. So land is cleared of all the vegetation, and then all the debris that's left behind is burned, and that burn, the ash, kind of brings nutrients then into the soil. And then that farmland is good for 2, 3, 4 years. And then after that, they have to move on to a new area of land. And that land that they had farmed for that 2, 3 years is now going to be left fallow for somewhere between 6 to 20 years before the nutrients actually end up back in the soil and it becomes good enough to farm again. And so this is a highly unsustainable agricultural type. And the reason why it's typically used is because they don't have anywhere else to farm. That's why we say it's pretty common in tropical areas. There's not a lot of farmland in tropical rainforests. And so the land that is being used is typically owned by local villages or local families in that area. But again, it leads to a lot of problems. Again, you need a lot of land in order to use this type of agriculture. You lose a lot of that land to other types of agriculture in those areas. We're starting to see more cattle ranching being done in and around tropical areas. And maybe the biggest issue is you have really extremely low yields, and you have to continually move to new land and grab and destroy new land each year or each couple of years. All right, so a very unsustainable practice, but still one that's being done in a lot of tropical areas. When we look at some of the issues that go along with shifting cultivation and slash and burn agriculture, here's some of the couple issues. Deforestation is a big one. And so when we look at that, the idea of deforestation is that you are obviously cutting down rainforests or cutting down forested areas in order to continually sustain this type of agriculture. And that's not something that's going to work in the long run. We also see that logging and ranching are being done a little bit more sustainably in some of those areas. All right, so those are a little bit more eco-friendly ways that the people in the tropical regions could probably make money or bring in food as well. Here's some of the causes of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazonian rainforest here. And so you can see maybe the biggest one obviously is pasture land. And again, that's where we see the rise of more cattle land in that area. And then you get to things like plantations, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then you see the small scale farming, which is what we're talking about here with the slash and burn agriculture, right? The shifting cultivation. About 12% of the land is being lost during that time period anyway, based on shifting cultivation. Another subsistence agricultural type we have is pastoral nomadism. We talked a little bit about this. This is most commonly done in dry areas. Like we said, we saw it across northern Africa, across the Sahara region. We saw it into the Middle East and into Central Asia, typically fairly dry areas where herding animals is a better outcome for people versus trying to farm on the farmland, because it's not going to be real sustainable farming if they were to be able to do anything. And so when we look at this type is based off of animals and kind of a culture of the environment that they're in. So we could see things like camels or goats or cattle, sheep. Those are kind of the four most common different types of pastoral nomadism. And a lot of times what we're seeing is they're using the milk and the fur or the skins in order to make money, and then they can trade those products in order to obtain the food that they need. And so they're not slaughtering those animals necessarily, but they are using the animal byproducts in order to obtain what they need. And so this is maintaining kind of a small subsistence farm maybe around that as well, so they can feed themselves in addition to what they're making off of the animals. We also see that they tend to follow migration patterns. That's why they're called nomads, pastoral nomadism. So they're moving from place to place to find pastoral areas for their flock or their herd, whatever it may be that they are herding around. And this kind of migration that they follow, which follows kind of a seasonal pattern, is called transhumance. And that's where you have people migrating from place to place, following or taking their herds with them over time. And again, this is kind of range-based. And so they're going from place to place here in a large area. Nomadic populations today are shrinking pretty dramatically, mainly due to technology and government pressure in general, and obviously competition for land. There's not a lot of places in the world where you just have open range land so people can herd their animals from place to place. So we're seeing a pretty massive drop in people who are practicing pastoral nomadism. It's still out there. It's just not as common as it once was. Here's some of the examples we can have here of pastoral nomadism. So you can see a little bit of southern Africa, or I should say northern Africa here when we look at pastoral nomadism on the right. Over there on the left, we have, looks like probably Mongolia when we look at it, because they're in those yurts right there. Those are pretty common. It could be Kazakhstan or somewhere else too. We look at Central Asia. And then on the far right there, again, that looks like it's most likely Middle Eastern, and you can see they're using goats in that case. So goats, sheep, cattle, all being used here in these pictures. Last but not least, when we talk about subsistence agriculture, we have one that is not actually subsistence agriculture, but we tend to lump it in with the other subsistence agriculture, and that's called plantation farming. And the reason we lump this in is because it's actually going to be in the same locations as some of these other subsistence. So it really kind of falls between the two of them. It's located in lesser developed countries typically, but it is actually a form of commercial agriculture. All right. These are large commercial farms that usually specialize in one or two different crops. They, like I said, typically found in tropical developing regions around the globe. Usually companies own these farms or these plantations, and they kind of start to develop the place around them as well. Some of the common crops we see in plantation farming: cotton, sugar, coffee, rubber, tobacco, sometimes maybe pineapple. There's other things as well that you might see in those plantation farming, but those are the kind of the ideas we're talking about. And the workers typically are imported from other sites or other countries. They're brought in to work there. They actually live right on the site, and they farm and work right there. And in some cases, obviously, they'll return back home at some point, but a lot of them do make their home then in the country that they're farming at that point. We know that plantation farming was once extremely popular and common in the United States as well, specifically before the Civil War. And that's when we get into like the forced migration and African slavery that we saw going on in the South at that time. But the typical plantation farms we saw at that point were cotton and tobacco. They were massive cash crops that were being sold, obviously, to make quite a bit of money. And that's one of the reasons why they felt they needed extra labor so they could make more money at that time. All right, so definitely a dark mark on U.S. history for sure. Here's some other places around the world where you see plantations. Again, they tend to be kind of located in that tropical region. So if we look at kind of between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, and you can see bananas, sugar, coffee, common ones, cotton. If you look across oil or oil palm, I should say, and rubber, coconuts is common, tea. So we can see that there's some specific crops that we tend to see being done more and more in plantations versus in other forms. Shifting away a little bit from what we have been talking about, we've been talking mainly about subsistence agriculture at this point. We're going to shift more into the commercial side of things. And as we get into commercial, one of the things that we talk about a little bit is the idea of not just agriculture and crops, but also fishing. Fishing has become sort of a form of agriculture at this point, or at least they call it aquaculture. And so we'll look a little bit into fishing as well. Fishing is obviously the capture of wild fish and other seafood living in the waters. And there are 16 major regions globally, as you can see there. Probably the most popular that we see anyway on TV all the time is the Pacific Northeast, because if you watch the show Deadliest Catch, they're always up there fishing for crab, right? The crab fishery. So very interesting. But if you look around, obviously there's quite a bit of area around the world that is being used as both commercial and subsistence forms of fishing. So if we take a look here, here's fish production based in, if we look specifically at South Asia and East Asia, obviously being the main areas where we see the most fishing going on, or fish production. But again, all over the world, we're seeing countries and areas that are using fish as an alternative form of food as well. Then we got into this idea that I just mentioned a minute ago, aquaculture or aqua farming, either one. When we talk about aquaculture, it is the cultivation of seafood under controlled conditions. So you're actually seeing this now if you buy fish. I'm actually not a big fish fan, but once in a while, my wife will want us to buy fish, so I'll buy it. And if you look on the packages now, a lot of times you will see whether it says wild caught on the package now. And so that is the difference between aquaculture and obviously wild caught or wild fished fish. And so in this case, when we look at aquaculture, it is a controlled condition, and over time they're kind of they're farming for these fish. Essentially, they're growing them and then harvesting them, basically. And so this expansion has really overtaken the wild fishing, or the capture fishing as they call it here. You can see the red line starting to even out, and you can see the orange line surpassing it here in the mid 2010s. So if we look at overfishing and how that affects the world, that's become one of the problems, and that's why we have seen less wild-caught fish. There has been different times throughout history where overfishing has been a big issue, and it's a major reduced supply in the world's oceans. And obviously, it's not just us taking food or taking fish out of the ocean, but obviously other ocean creatures need those fish in order to survive as well. And so global demand has put pressure on two major fish, that is tuna fish and swordfish. Their populations have actually been reduced by about 90%. And so that's why we have to be careful about overfishing when we're doing this. And that, again, that's why we're seeing the rise of aquaculture to some extent. We are producing our own fish, harvesting our own fish, so that we're not taking from the world global supply either. All right, so we're shifting into looking at commercial agriculture now. We just got into kind of that commercial aquaculture a little bit. Now shifting into commercial agriculture. Most commercial agriculture we're going to see is going to tend to be in more developed countries around the world. And so as we look at the first of our commercial agriculture, we're going to start with grain farming. And so we have wheat, corn, oats, barley, rice, millet. Anything that would be grain-based here is going to be considered part of grain farming. And this is basically all done for human consumption. Not all of it, but most of it is. A lot of times we look at this as being monocropping. When we talk about like the corn belt, that's a monocropping area. Most of those areas, they grow basically one crop. I mean, there's other small crops too, but monocropping is this idea that you're growing one large crop on the entire farm. And so we've seen this shift from developed, and we're starting to see it in some developing regions around the world too, simply because they need the caloric intake, they need the food, and monocropping and grain farming has become an easy way to get the food and the nutrition that people need. This is maybe the most important crop in the entire world, and that's wheat. All right. When we look at wheat, you can make flour out of it. It is the #1 exported crop worldwide. And if we look at where we see that, the United States actually led the world in grain production for a long time. Today, we actually rank #4. All right. Canada always kind of vied for us up there at the top too. But today we are ranked #4 for grain production. You can see all the different types of grain that we have and where they tend to be located as well. So if we see a shift in some of the production levels here, you can see the United States still ranks up there really high. We're starting to see more and more in Russia. We're starting to see more and more in India and China as well. And that's where we look at, those are kind of your big four right there. Canada kind of right behind everyone there as well. So looking closer here, we have some dot maps. When it comes to agriculture, dot maps tend to be used a lot of times. And we're looking at each one of those dots represents 10,000 acres of wheat. And so you can see all the different wheat and kind of where it's grown in the United States. I will tell you this, you're going to need to know basic ideas of where things are grown worldwide and where things are grown in the United States. All right, so we're looking at wheat here and grain. We can also see some of the places where the most lucrative food crop in each state is wheat, and it's basically anything that's kind of that golden color there is all wheat. All right, that's the most lucrative crop in all those states. All right, who would have thought potatoes when we're talking about Wisconsin? All right, obviously the potato king, though, if we look over, is definitely Idaho with $1 billion in potatoes. Right, but again, all of that is that wheat farming that we're talking about, that grain farming. So it's pretty common all across the United States for grain. Moving on, we're taking a look at Mediterranean agriculture. This is a type of agriculture that is well known for fruits and vegetables, basically different kinds of tree crops. It's found obviously in the Mediterranean Sea and in the area bordering the Mediterranean Sea, but there's a couple other places around the world where they have the climate that sustains Mediterranean agriculture as well. We find it in California. We find it on the coast of Chile in South America, and we find it in South Africa as well. And so the climate that we're talking about here is places that have fairly mild winters, so it doesn't get too hot, too cold. And then we look at places that have very hot, very dry summers. And that allows those crops to grow really well during that time. And then obviously the winters being mild, it doesn't kill off those trees and those crops. And so when we look at this, it's known for human consumption, obviously. We're talking about fruits, vegetables, tree crops. So anything that's olives, grapes, dates, different citrus fruit are well known, and maybe the most well known item that we have here from Mediterranean agriculture is actually wine. And so the wine regions of Italy, France, and California are really well known for their wine, and the grapes that are grown there are different than grapes you would just eat. They are grown specifically for winemaking as well. And so if we take a look at grapes being grown in the United States, you can see very heavily in California, a little bit more in the Pacific Northwest, but that kind of region right in the center of California, we're going to see a lot of different crops being grown there, especially Mediterranean style crops. So here's your grapes. Here's your wine production worldwide. Again, your Mediterranean region, Spain, France, Italy, obviously being big ones. But again, because of California, the United States ranks on there, Chile down there, Argentina, South Africa as well. And you can see Australia and China, well known for wine too. But no one's hitting quite as much as the France, Spain, and Italy there for sure. Here's your wineries around the United States. Again, heavily West Coast oriented, and that's because of the climate, the agriculture there. There are wineries all over the U.S., as you can see here, but the agricultural climate that they have with the Mediterranean climate really is good for wine growing, or grape growing, I should say, year round, and so they're able to make that into wine. Not as good here in Minnesota. There are wineries, but obviously not year-round production. Here's another type of fruit we're talking about here. Here's our plums and prunes. Again, all in that Central Valley, as they call it, in California. And we'll talk more about the Central Valley. There's our lemons. Again, very heavily California. There's a few in some other spots too. You can see a little in Florida as well. Then we get into commercial gardening. And so we're talking a lot about like fruits and vegetables with our last couple of ideas here, Mediterranean agriculture and our commercial gardening agriculture areas. This is also called truck farming. And so when we're talking about truck farming, we typically are talking about fruit specifically. It could be vegetables as well, obviously, but a lot of times we call this fruit farming. And so we talk about the most common areas in the United States are the Southeast and the Northeast when we look at commercial gardening. These typically are long growing seasons, very humid summers. And the idea is that they're located close to the market. They can get things in and out from the farm or the orchard right into the market right away. And so a lot of times we'll see commercial gardening located closer to major cities. So if you talk about some of the common crops, apples, cherries, lettuce, tomatoes, strawberries, again, most of these are sold to large processors so that they can send them in, freeze them, can them, sell them to you in the store. But a lot of times they're used, you might see, and this is the reason why it's called truck farming, you might see trucks or stands on the side of the road sometimes, right? Or you might go to the apple orchard and buy them right from the orchard as well. Whenever possible, in order to speed up the production here, machines are used to make the labor easier. Human labor is sometimes done if it can't be a machine, and when that's done, we tend to see this being done by a group of migrant workers that are kind of traveling around the country, harvesting in different parts of the country at different times. So different migrant workers are usually performing the human labor. And again, we see a lot of specialty farming, specifically in New England. So we might see things like asparagus. You might see kind of some nursery plants being done as well. All right, but again, this is kind of the majority of our fruit and fruit and vegetables, I should say, that are being grown. So if you look at our vegetables there, it's cut off a little bit, but you can see very heavily in the West Coast again. But again, you can see other parts around kind of major cities where you're seeing some deeper shades of green as well. Here's our fruits. Again, heavily West Coast, heavily South, a lot in the Northeast as well. And then we're looking at kind of vegetables being harvested for sale. Again, we're seeing it throughout a lot of larger populous areas, but a lot on the West Coast, obviously, as well. Again, that Central Valley is pretty evident in every one of them that we're looking at. And again, you can see quite a bit throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. Again, we're talking about vegetables and fruit. Again, they've got to be kind of close to their market, because if they're not close to the market, they could spoil or go bad if it takes too long to get there. Here's your apples. And again, if you look really closely, obviously we have lots of apple orchards around us, but compared to the other places, we're not seeing as much. Again, Northeast and a little bit in the Pacific Northwest as well. There's your peaches. So you can see heavily in California again, and we have to look at the peach state. Excuse me. We look at Georgia, a lot of peaches being grown there, and we also have South Carolina, a little bit in kind of the Potomac area, and the Pennsylvania, New Jersey as well. And there's our oranges again, West Coast a little bit in California, but again the orange state. We look at Florida, and lots of oranges being grown down in Florida. There's some people harvesting strawberries, so that would be kind of your migrant workers. They go from place to place. And if you've ever gone to an orchard or to a strawberry patch, I should say, and done some strawberry picking, not easy labor. It actually, if you're in there legitimately picking strawberries and not just kind of picking from ones here and there, it's pretty hard work, right? Down on your hands and knees and going from plant to plant. Here they are harvesting cranberries. All right, so the cranberries are interesting. The cranberries are actually hollow on the inside, so they flood the field when they're ready to be picked, and they float up to the top of the surface, and then they're able to kind of use these large vacuums, and they push the cranberries into these vacuums, and then that helps them harvest them. This is maybe my favorite one. This is called the tree shaker. And so basically what they do is they will lay out a tarp, where you can see this new machine kind of has a place to catch everything. And then they wrap this kind of mechanical arm around it, and they shake the tree really hard until everything falls off. So whether it's typically not used with apples necessarily, but smaller tree fruits and things like that we don't have to worry about bruising when they fall, but they'll fall off, and then they gather everything up, and that's one way that they can automate things and make it a little bit quicker. All right, so that was our commercial gardening. Taking a look at livestock ranching, this is again pretty common. This is another version of commercial agriculture. And when we talk about livestock ranching, it's pretty common in areas again where you can't grow crops. Basically, this is very similar to pastoral nomadism, except this is the commercial version of it. And so we see grazing of livestock over pretty large areas typically when we talk about ranching. And we've seen this kind of shifting to being more a form of in developed to developing countries today. So we're starting to see this in some lesser developed countries now. China is producing twice as much meat as the United States is today. South America, we see quite a bit of ranching and livestock ranching going on as well. And so when we talk about this grazing land, and this is a big reason why we're seeing less of this in the U.S., grazing land is declining pretty quickly. And so as grazing land starts to decline, these cattle are being sent to commercial feedlots instead. And so rather than have them out kind of grazing on their own and then you round them up like cowboys used to do, now they send them to these commercial feedlots. They fatten them up by feeding them corn, which is actually something that cows aren't supposed to eat. And then they go through and use different techniques then for the land. They make the land in that area more arable so that it can be actually used to grow crops instead of graze animal on them or animals. So here's commercial feedlots, and these are called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. This is what's kind of taking over in a lot of areas where the idea of livestock ranching once existed. And these are essentially places where it's almost kind of like aquaculture. They're growing cows, basically, fattening them up and then sending them off to slaughter. If you look at that picture on the right, that's not a city in the background. That's the slaughterhouse. And so they literally grow up on this land all around kind of the processing plant. And then when it's time to process them, they herd them towards the processing plant, slaughter them, and then pack up the meat and ship it out. All right, so these are actually pretty bad for the environment around where they're located. Again, you've got a concentration of all these animals together. It's not really good for the land and the area and the resources around it. Here's a feedlot in Mexico, so you can kind of see the same thing here. Lots and lots of cattle being herded around there, and you can see them all in these different pens. And again, they'll come by with a truck. They'll kind of spray out the food, the corn, and let them eat it. And again, the idea is to fatten them up. So they gain a couple thousand pounds basically from calf to heifer before they're slaughtered and taken to market. Here's some of the cattle and calves we see in our U.S. here. Again, each dot represents between 10,000 cattle and calf. So again, a lot in the central portion of the country. Here's some of the other areas around the world where we see livestock ranching. So the areas that are in the kind of the red are areas that we see specific to cattle ranching or whatever they happen to be um, denoting here. So we can see cattle in South America and North America, sheep in South Africa and in Central Asia, and then we look at sheep as well in Australia. But again, all those places there, you can see some kind of meat production going on. So Brazil, uh, United States, and China really being your top meat producing countries in the world. Another form of cattle that we see being used is dairy farming. When we talk about dairy farming, this is often located near urban areas, and that's what they call the milk shed. And that urban area is the market and the market area that they're able to bring that milk to. The idea of the milk shed is that it's kind of a ring around the city where milk can actually be supplied quickly to the city or the urban area around it. And so we're starting to see more and more development of dairy farming in lesser developed countries. India now has become the #1 dairy producing state or country in the world. And we know that a lot of this milk is actually sold then to processors, sold on to retailers or processors. Its final form then depends on how close they are to the market. So we know that a lot of the milk in the Northeast and in the West stays as milk, whereas a lot of the milk coming from Wisconsin, because it's not close to a lot of large markets, is actually turned into cheese, which makes it easier to ship further without it spoiling or going bad. And so some of the challenges we look at is this is a really, really labor intensive product. All right. Hard work, very little profit. You have to be with the animals all year. In fact, my wife's family raised cattle, or I should say raised they had a dairy farm, and her uncle was the one that owned the farm. They couldn't leave. They couldn't ever go on vacations. They had to be there so they could milk the cows in the morning and in the afternoon or at night. All right. They had to be there year round, essentially, with them. It's really expensive to feed them, especially during the winter, or keep them warm. If it gets too cold, especially in Minnesota and Wisconsin, your cattle will die. And so you have to make sure you're keeping them warm and keeping them heated. And obviously, maybe the biggest issue is the fluctuating milk price. There has been times in the last couple years where the prices dropped low enough where farmers literally take and just open up their stores and just pour it in the streets or pour it down the drain because they're not going to make any money. All right. And so that the idea is that they're trying to create scarcity so that the price would go up. So supply and demand. If the supply of milk is down, then the demand would go up. All right. But the idea of this is again, very, very challenging, hard work, very little profit in the dairy business. Here's milk cows across the United States. Again, heavy in Wisconsin, Minnesota, but actually the #1 and #2 producing states are New York and California. It doesn't necessarily look that way on the map, but that is the way it goes. Again, Wisconsin coming in third. Here's our importing and exporting milk. So you can see just how much is being exported or imported. So you can see the net exporters. And again, it's dairy products as well. So you can see that the biggest really being, actually Idaho exporting quite a bit of dairy product as well, but Wisconsin doing obviously a lot of cheese, a lot of dairy as well, or milk, I should say, as well. Here's your world milk production. There's India popping up as kind of taking over that #1 spot from the United States. And that leads us to another livestock farming, and that is mixed crop and livestock farming. Again, this is very common in the central portion of the United States, and it's actually pretty common in Europe as well. This is the integration of crops and livestock together. So you're growing crops in order to feed the livestock, and most time it's corn or soybeans that are being grown, and you're feeding the animals or the cattle that food, and you're able to rotate the crops in order to maintain yield. So one year field 1 will be soybeans, the next year field 1 will be corn, and so on and so forth. You'll rotate around usually 3 or 4 fields. And then again, your income is actually derived from selling the animals. In this case, you're most likely selling the animals for slaughter. All right. And so you're making your money by selling that animal each year. So the benefits here are typically that there's a more distributed workload. You've got the cattle, you've got the actual crops as well. And so it's a much more stable income than dairy farming or other methods of farming that we just talked about too. So again, another commercial agricultural type here. If we take a look at the rise of corn, looking at some of the propaganda that's happened over time, you can see the "Eat less bread" was one of the lines here, and corn, the food of the nation, trying to get people to eat more corn, specifically during World War I, when there was rationing and a lot of shortages of different types of food. A couple more propaganda posters here. So eat your oatmeal and corn. Again, kind of adding to having to divert food stocks to the Western Front and to be able to feed the troops as well. Again, seeing some of the rationing going on here. There's some others. So wheat, meat, fats, and sugars. That's getting the idea of not just using those, but making sure that you are using other things, corn and fish and beans and syrups, instead of just straight using those other items. Again, rationing was being done in World War I. We'll see it in World War II as well. And then here's your corn. We talked about kind of the grain earlier. Looking across the Midwest, that is the Corn Belt right there. We talk about that. We talked about that a little bit with regions as well. It's basically a functional region right there, a formal region technically, because they're all together. They all essentially are doing the same thing. They're all big corn states, corn producing states. Here's your average corn yields, worldwide, or excuse me, in the United States. You can see that since 1940, we've increased the production of corn pretty greatly. And today, really, almost everything you can buy in the store is somehow made out of corn. All right, whether it's corn syrup or the actual corn being used, or even the meat that you're eating. A lot of times they're using corn to feed the animals as well. There are soybeans, another one of our grains we just talked about earlier. As you can see, again, pretty heavily across the Corn Belt as well, following down the Mississippi. There's your hogs and pigs. So that's your mixed livestock, mixed crops and livestock, I should say. You can see quite a bit in North Carolina as well. Iowa, obviously, your number one hog or pig state. There's your turkeys. Minnesota, number one turkey producing state in the nation right there. You can see 45.5 million turkeys in Minnesota. And then here's our U.S. agricultural regions. All right, looking at some of those major areas, we've got that dairy belt we kind of talked a little bit about. We've got the corn belt. You can see the old cotton belt in the south there. Then we get into some of the different wheats and grains as well that are being farmed. And then we look over to the West Coast, and agricultural, the Mediterranean agriculture in those areas. Again, very important for feeding our nation. Fruits and vegetables tend to come from that area. So as we look at these different agricultural regions in the United States, again, you should have a basic idea of where things are being farmed. But there's also a kind of a theory that kind of goes along with it. And that theory was created by this man right here, von Thunen. All right. Von Thunen was a German geographer, and right around the time of 1826, he came up with this idea that he called the von Thunen model. And that model was that he said farmers chose crops and animals to raise based on what their proximity to a market was. And so he put into place two costs. He said land and transportation are the major influencers besides where someone is based on the market. All right, so land and transportation. And so the cost of the land, the further from the market or the closer to the market, and how much it costs to transport a good or an animal, whatever it may be, from the farm to the market. And so he put in place what he called this concentric model. In the middle, you have the city. And from there, you work your way out in these different rings of agriculture. The first one is the dairy and market gardens. So anything that's perishable needs to get to the city fast. So they're going to pay more for their land, but pay less for transportation. In the next ring, he called it the woodlots. We don't have to worry about woodlots because they used that basically for heating their houses, right? They had to chop down wood. They had to bring it in from the city. That we don't have woodlots anymore. We don't have to worry about chopping wood to heat our houses. The third ring was kind of various crops like grains and pasture land for animals. And then on the outside, you got to the fourth ring, which was kind of animal grazing. And so this is basically this idea of the further you get from the city, the cheaper the land is this idea of bid rent theory. So yes, you might be further from the city. If you need a lot of land to graze your animals, you're going to have to buy cheaper land, which is further from the city. It might cost you a little bit more to transport than it would if you were close, but that land is going to be cheaper and save you money. And so here's kind of what von Thunen's model looks like here. All right, so you can see it on the left, the straight concentric, and then on the right is if it's interrupted by, say, a river or something. All right, but you've got that central city, which is your market, and then as you move out, different types of agriculture inhabiting different rings around that city. And again, the further you go, the more land you need for your agriculture. So again, here's that idea. Again, closer you are, we have things like horticulture and dairying. So that's your truck farming, that's your dairy farming. And again, those things spoil, they go bad. So you need to be able to get them to the market faster. On the outside, you're going to have things like grazing animals, maybe ranching. And again, you need more land for that. And then you can transport those things into the city later on. And so when we look at von Thunen's model, does it hold true today? It's pretty tough. When we look at the United States, we don't have like a central hub in the United States. And so I would say von Thunen's model probably doesn't work that well, especially when we look at the idea of transportation and the cost of transportation, how low it's become since the 1820s. But if we look at it, we could maybe look at Minnesota and see if von Thunen's model works. And so we can kind of identify a central city. We can talk about the Twin Cities, right? Minneapolis and St. Paul could be our central city. And if we take a look, we can kind of work out from there. And you can see, if you look at these two right here, we've got our dairy cows are the darkest shaded counties there. That's where they typically are. And they're located fairly close to the Twin Cities there. We've got our apple orchards, again, located right around the Twin Cities. As you move out a little bit, you start to get into your grain farming, and that's what we see in the southern Minnesota and up in northern Minnesota there, your grain farming, corn and wheat. And then we look at beef, and you can see that's further down as well, way out in southwestern Minnesota and southeastern Minnesota. So if we look at Minnesota, it does kind of form these kind of concentric rings to some extent. So von Thunen maybe loosely works in Minnesota. Whereas if we look at it on a national scale, it probably really doesn't work at this point. But this basic model does kind of work when we can pinpoint a central city like Minneapolis and St. Paul.